My daughter said, "I have a surprise for you," and handed me an envelope. I thought it was a late birthday card. It wasn't. It was a demand for my entire life's savings. When I refused, she gave me a second surprise, a face full of scalding coffee. An hour later, as I stood on the lawn of the home I built, the police arrived. But they weren't there for her. They were there for me. If you believe that a parent's love should never be a blank check for disrespect, please like and subscribe and let me know in the comments where you are listening from. The morning had started with a quiet peace that felt sacred. I'm David Peterson. I'm 68 years old, and since my wife Clara passed last year, these quiet moments are what I have left. The sunlight streamed into the kitchen the same way it had for 40 years, illuminating the little dust motes dancing in the air. It was a good house, a strong house filled with the ghosts of happy memories. I was stirring honey into my morning tea when the doorbell rang. It was my daughter Jessica and her husband Mark. I felt a familiar pang of hope, the foolish kind that never seems to learn. Maybe this time would be different. They walked in with smiles that didn't quite reach their eyes. Mark clapped me on the shoulder a little too hard, a gesture that was supposed to be friendly, but felt more like an appraisal. Jessica kissed the air beside my cheek. "We were just in the neighborhood, Dad," she said, her voice bright and brittle. They never were just in the neighborhood. Their visits were always calculated, always leading to a request. I poured them coffee, my hands steady, betraying none of the caution I felt coiling in my gut. We sat at the small oak table where I'd once helped Jessica with her third-grade homework. After a few minutes of strained small talk about the weather and their new SUV, Jessica slid a cream-colored envelope across the table. Her smile widened. "I have a surprise for you, Dad." I picked it up. It was crisp and felt important. For a second, I let myself imagine it was an ultrasound picture, or perhaps tickets for a trip together. I looked at her, searching for a genuine spark of affection in her eyes, but found only a tense anticipation. I slid my finger under the seal and pulled out the folded papers inside. It wasn't a letter. It was a collection of official-looking documents filled with dense legal text. At the top of the first page, in bold, unforgiving letters, was a debt notice. My eyes scanned the page, trying to make sense of the numbers, but one figure stood out, screaming at me from the paper. $600,000. The name on the notice wasn't mine. It was Mark's. I looked up from the paper, my mind struggling to connect the dots. The silence in the room was suddenly heavy, suffocating. Mark leaned forward, the fake charm gone, replaced by a cold, hard sense of entitlement. "It was an investment," he said, as if that explained everything. "A crypto thing. It went south." He waved his hand dismissively, as if $600,000 was a minor inconvenience like a parking ticket. "The point is, it has to be paid by Monday noon." He didn't sound worried. He sounded demanding. Jessica placed her hand on my arm, her touch not comforting but possessive. "Dad, we know you have your retirement savings," she said, her voice dropping into a conspiratorial whisper. "You and Mom were always so careful. It's just sitting there." It wasn't just sitting there. It was my future. It was the 40 years I'd spent at a desk, meticulously balancing ledgers as an accountant. It was Clara's years of teaching, of summers spent grading papers while I did the yard work. It was the vacations we'd skipped, the old car we'd driven for a decade longer than we should have. It was our security, our peace of mind, the final promise we had given to each other to never be a burden on anyone. "This is our big break," Dad. Mark pressed on, his voice rising with impatience. "Once this is cleared, I have another deal lined up. A sure thing. We'll pay you back double." There was no sure thing. I'd been an accountant my entire life. I knew a desperate lie when I heard one. He wasn't asking for a loan. He was demanding a bailout. I took a slow breath, trying to keep my voice even. I looked at my daughter, the little girl I had taught to ride a bike on the very lawn outside this window. I saw no trace of her in the hardened face of the woman sitting before me. No, I said. The word was quiet, but it landed in the center of the room like a stone. Jessica's eyes widened first in disbelief, then narrowing into fury. No. What do you mean no? She snapped. Mark scoffed. Don't be ridiculous. It's just money. What else are you going to do with it? I felt a cold anger begin to burn through my shock. That money, I said, my voice gaining strength, is everything your mother and I worked for. It's for my old age. It is not for your crypto thing. That was when Jessica's mask of civility finally shattered. Her face twisted into an ugly sneer. You never help us. You never support us, she screamed, her voice shrill. Mom would have given it to us. She loved me. The mention of Clara was a knife in my heart. Clara would have been heartbroken. She would have seen the greed that I had been blind to for so long. Before I could respond, Jessica lunged. She grabbed her still full mug of hot coffee and with a vicious flick of her wrist threw its contents at me. The searing heat hit my chest and neck, a shocking, blooming pain. I gasped, stumbling back in my chair. The dark liquid soaked my shirt, scalding my skin, but the physical pain was nothing compared to the agony of her betrayal. Through the haze of pain, I heard Mark's voice full of venom. This is our house now, old man. Get out! Get out! He grabbed my arm, his fingers digging into my bicep, and hauled me out of my chair. I was too stunned, too hurt to resist. He shoved me toward the front door, the one I had painted a welcoming blue just last summer. He pushed me out onto the porch and slammed the door shut. The click of the deadbolt echoed in the quiet morning air. I stood there on my own front porch, shivering from shock, the smell of stale coffee mixing with the sweet scent of the rose bushes Clara had planted. My chest was on fire. My heart was a block of ice. I looked through the window and saw Jessica on the phone. Her face was a mask of theatrical panic. She was yelling into the receiver, words I couldn't hear but could easily guess. He's crazy. He attacked us. I'm scared. Then in the distance I heard it. A faint rising siren. It grew louder and louder, a piercing wail that sounded like the end of the world. My world. The police were coming. And in that moment, standing on the grass, where my daughter took her first steps, I realized they weren't coming to help me. They were coming for me. The police cruiser rolled to a stop at the curb, its lights painting silent, flashing strokes of red and blue across my neighbor's manicured lawns. 2 officers stepped out. One was older with a calm, weathered face that said he'd seen it all. The other was younger, his movements sharp and alert. Jessica immediately transformed into the perfect victim. She ran toward them, her face streaked with tears that hadn't been there a moment ago. Thank God you're here, she sobbed, pointing a trembling finger at me. It's my father. He just snapped. He became violent. We're so scared. Mark wrapped a protective arm around her, his face a mask of feigned concern. We're just worried about him, officers, he said, his voice dripping with false sincerity. He's been confused lately. He thinks this is still his house. The older officer, whose name tag read Riley, approached me while his partner kept Jessica and Mark talking. His eyes were neutral, assessing. He didn't look at me like I was a criminal. He looked at me like I was part of a puzzle he had to solve. Sir, he began, his voice even. Can you tell me what happened here? I didn't raise my voice. I didn't cry or plead. The fire in my chest had burned away the shock, leaving behind a cold, hard clarity. This is my home, I said simply. My daughter and her husband demanded I give them my retirement savings. When I refused, she threw her coffee on me. I gestured to the dark, wet stain on my shirt. Officer Riley's gaze followed my hand, and I saw a flicker of understanding in his eyes as he noticed the angry red welt already forming on my skin. His partner called out from the porch. They're saying he's trespassing, Riley, that they let him live here but he became aggressive. Officer Riley never took his eyes off me. Sir, can you confirm your name for me? And who is the legal owner of this property? My name is David Peterson, I said, and I am the sole owner of this house. My wife Clara Peterson passed away last year. Her name may also be on the deed. Officer Riley spoke into the radio on his shoulder, relaying my name and the address. We all stood in a strange, suspended silence, the only sound, the crackle of the police radio. Jessica watched, a smug certainty on her face, believing her lie was about to be validated. Then the voice came back over the radio, clear and metallic in the quiet air. Confirming property at 125 Oak Street is registered to a David Peterson. Sole ownership, no liens. The change was immediate. Officer Riley's shoulders relaxed and he gave me a slight nod. He turned and walked toward the porch, his entire demeanor having shifted from investigator to enforcer. The younger officer looked at Jessica and Mark with a new, undisguised suspicion. "Ma'am, Sir Officer Riley," said, his voice now carrying a stern edge of authority. "Filing a false police report is a serious offense. This man is the legal owner of this home. If anyone is trespassing here, it is you." Jessica's face went pale. The tears vanished. Mark's jaw tightened, his bravado crumbling into dust. They stammered, trying to backtrack, but the lie had been exposed. The law, at least for this brief moment, was on my side. Officer Riley walked back over to me. His voice softened slightly. "Mr. Peterson, legally, you have every right to stay here. You can have them removed if you wish. But I've been doing this job for 30 years. I can see this is a heated family matter. Right now, everyone's tempers are high." He looked from me to the house, then back again. "My professional recommendation: don't stay here tonight. Let things cool down. We can't force you to leave, but it might be the wisest thing to do, for your own peace of mind." And in that moment, I understood. Winning this battle on the lawn meant nothing. To win the war, I needed a different strategy. I needed to retreat, regroup, and fight on my own terms. I looked at Officer Riley and gave him a slow nod. There was no point in arguing. Forcing my way back into my own house with a police escort would only feed the narrative Jessica and Mark were so eager to create, the one where I was the unstable, aggressive old man. I saw the triumphant smirk on Jessica's face as she watched me, believing she had won, that she had successfully painted me as the villain in my own home. My eyes met hers across the lawn. The warmth I had held for her my entire life, a steady flame that had burned for 35 years, flickered and went out. In its place was something cold, something hard. It was the calm of a still, deep lake just before the ice sets. I didn't shout. I didn't threaten. I just held her gaze and said one word to the officer, a word that was meant entirely for my daughter. "All right." I turned without another glance and walked to my car. Each step felt deliberate, heavy. I could feel their eyes on my back, but I refused to look back. Looking back meant I was leaving something behind. I wasn't. I was taking everything that mattered with me, my dignity, my memories of Clara, and this newfound, chilling resolve. I got into the driver's seat of my old Buick, the car Clara and I had taken on our last road trip to see the autumn colors in Vermont. The interior smelled faintly of her favorite vanilla air freshener. It was a gut punch of a memory. I started the engine and pulled away from the curb, driving down the familiar street with the careful precision of a man who had nothing but time. This was not a retreat born from fear. It was a tactical withdrawal. I was a 68-year-old retired accountant, not a soldier, but I knew you didn't fight a battle on ground chosen by your enemy. You fell back, you found higher ground, and you prepared for a different kind of war. I drove until the familiar neighborhood faded into the anonymous landscape of highways and strip malls. I found a generic hotel, a clean, respectable place with no character and no questions. The young woman at the front desk gave me a polite, professional smile as I paid for a room for the night. The room itself was a universe away from my home. It was sterile, smelling of industrial cleaner and air conditioning. The art on the wall was a bland, mass-produced print of a sailboat. There were no photographs on the mantelpiece, no worn-out armchair molded to the shape of my body, no sense of history. It was just a room, a place to be when you had nowhere else to go. I locked the door behind me and leaned against it, the silence of the room amplifying the roaring in my head. I walked into the bathroom and stood in front of the mirror. I looked like a stranger to myself. My face was pale, my eyes hollow with a grief so profound it felt like a physical weight. I carefully peeled away the collar of my shirt. The skin on my chest and neck was an angry, blotchy red, already starting to blister where the coffee had been hottest. It stung, a persistent, irritating burn. But as I stared at the injury, I realized it was a blessing. The physical pain was a dull, shallow distraction. It was nothing, absolutely nothing, compared to the deep, invisible wound beneath it. A burn on the skin would heal. But the searing betrayal from my own child, the person Clara and I had poured all our love into, felt like an injury to the soul. And I wasn't sure a wound that deep could ever truly fade. The sterile silence of the hotel room was a prison. I couldn't stay in it. Action was the only antidote to the poison of despair that was flooding my system. I picked up my phone. My hands weren't shaking anymore. They were steady. There was only one person I could call. I dialed the number from memory, a number I had known for 50 years. It rang twice before a familiar, gravelly voice answered. George Franklin. George wasn't just my lawyer. He was my oldest friend. We'd been roommates in a dorm room the size of a closet back in college, and had been in each other's corners ever since. He was the best man at my wedding, the godfather to Jessica. He knew my whole life, the good, the bad, and now the ugly. George, I said, and my voice sounded hollow like it was coming from a great distance. It's David. There was a pause. George could read my voice like a book. David. What's wrong? You sound terrible. And so I told him. I recounted the whole sordid story, from the surprise envelope, to the scalding coffee, to the approaching sirens. I told it flatly without emotion, like I was reading an auditor's report on a company that had gone bankrupt. Because that's what it felt like. A lifetime of emotional investment liquidated in a single brutal morning. On the other end of the line, the silence was heavy. When George finally spoke, his voice was dangerously quiet at first, like the low rumble before an earthquake. Then the fury erupted. That ungrateful little... He swore a string of curses that was both shocking and deeply comforting. He put his hands on you, and Jessica let him. She did that to you. His rage was a fire burning on my behalf, warming the frozen parts of my soul. It felt good for a moment to not be alone in my anger. I'll tear them apart, David. I'll have them disbarred from the human race. He took a deep, steadying breath, and when he spoke again, the friend had receded, and the lawyer had taken his place. His voice was sharp, focused, a weapon being unsheathed. Okay, listen to me. Do not under any circumstances speak to them again. Don't answer their calls, don't reply to their texts. You say nothing. Understand, I said. Good, he replied. Now, David, I need you to think. Do you remember that briefcase, the old leather one Clara had me put together for you about 5 years ago? My mind fumbled for a moment. Then it came into focus. A thin, worn leather case she had given me a few months before she passed. She had been so insistent about it. It's in our safe deposit box, I said. What about it? George's voice was urgent. Clara made me promise. She said you were only to open it if you ever truly needed to protect yourself from them. I think now qualifies, don't you? I want you in my office at 9 o'clock tomorrow morning. Sharp. And David, he said, his voice dropping with significance, you bring that briefcase with you. You bring whatever final gift your wise wife left for you. After we hung up, I sat on the edge of the unfamiliar bed. The path ahead was dark and uncertain. But now, for the first time since the coffee hit my chest, I could see a light. It was a flicker in the distance, a final message in a bottle from the love of my life, and I would follow it. The next morning, I bypassed my home and drove straight to the downtown branch of the city bank. The air inside was cool and quiet, smelling of old paper and quiet money. It was a place of order, of rules and ledgers, a world I understood. A kind teller led me into the vault. The massive steel door swung open with a heavy, satisfying thud, revealing rows upon rows of anonymous metal boxes. Mine was number 347. She used her key, I used mine, and the small door opened. Inside, behind my birth certificate and the deed to the house, was the briefcase. It was made of soft, worn brown leather, cracked and creased with age. It looked like something a country doctor would have carried a century ago. It was unassuming, easily overlooked. But as I lifted it out, I felt its weight, a significance that went beyond the papers it held. Glued to the front, just below the tarnished brass clasps, was a small yellowed envelope. On it, in my wife's elegant, familiar script, were words that made my breath catch in my throat. For David, the note read. For when Jessica forgets who she is. My hands trembled as I traced the letters of her name. It was as if she were in the vault with me, her hand on my shoulder. I carried the briefcase to one of the private viewing rooms, a small wood-paneled cubicle with a single chair and a desk. I sat there for a long time, just looking at it, at this final piece of her I had yet to discover. My mind drifted back to the last days in the hospital, the sterile smell of the room, the relentless beeping of the machines that were failing to keep her with me. I remembered one afternoon when the sun was low and the room was filled with a soft, golden light. She had been weak, her voice a fragile whisper, but her eyes were as clear and sharp as ever. She had gripped my hand, her fingers surprisingly strong. David, promise me something, she had said, her gaze intense. Promise me you'll always protect our girl. I had knotted my throat tight with unshed tears. Of course, my love. Always. She had squeezed my hand harder. No, she'd insisted, a flicker of her old fire returning. You don't understand. Promise me you will protect her, even if it means protecting her from herself. I didn't understand it then. I thought she was talking about a scraped knee, a broken heart, the normal troubles of life. I never imagined she was talking about this. I never imagined she was foreseeing a day when Jessica's own greed would become her greatest enemy. Now, sitting in the cold silence of the bank, her words echoed in my mind, no longer a loving plea, but a solemn, urgent warning. With a deep breath, I unlatched the clasps on the briefcase. It was time to see what Clara, in her infinite wisdom, had left behind to help me keep that promise. Back in the sterile quiet of the hotel room, I placed the old leather briefcase on the bed. It felt like a sacred object, a time capsule sent from a past that was wiser than my present. The brass clasps clicked open with a sound that seemed to echo in the silence. The scent of old paper and Clara's subtle perfume, a scent I thought I'd forgotten, rose to meet me. For a moment I felt a wave of grief so powerful it almost made me close it again. But George's words and Clara's last promise pushed me forward. On top was a stack of papers I recognized immediately. The original deed to our house, the one we'd signed with trembling, youthful hands 40 years ago. Beneath it were old property tax receipts, the mortgage satisfaction letter from the day we'd finally paid it all off, a moment of triumph we'd celebrated with a cheap bottle of champagne. These were the artifacts of our shared life, the tangible proof of the home we had built together, brick by brick, year by year. It was all there just as I expected. But underneath that stack was something else, something I did not expect. It was a thick, professionally bound document with a dark blue cover. The gold embossed letters on the front seemed to gleam in the dim hotel lighting. The Peterson Family Irrevocable Trust. I stared at the words, a knot of confusion tightening in my stomach. I was a retired accountant. I understood trusts and financial instruments. But I had no memory of this, not in this detail, not with this level of formality. I remembered Clara mentioning something about estate planning with George, but I had been so focused on her health. I had trusted her to handle it, signing papers where she told me to sign. I never imagined she had been building a fortress around our legacy. My hands shook slightly as I opened the cover. The language was dense, full of legal terms, but I forced myself to read it slowly, my accountant's eye scanning for the critical details. And then I found them. Grantors David Peterson and Clara Peterson. We had created it together. Trustees David Peterson and Clara Peterson. My eyes scanned further down the page, my heart beginning to beat faster. Upon the death of one trustee, the text read, "The surviving grantor shall assume the role of sole acting trustee, with all rights and powers therein." I was in charge, fully and completely. Then I found the section on beneficiaries. There was only one name, Jessica Peterson. But next to her name was a word that changed everything: conditional. My finger traced the lines of text that followed the conditions that Clara, in her quiet wisdom, had laid out like a map for a future she knew might come. Jessica was entitled to live in and enjoy the property, but only so long as she acted in good faith and did nothing to endanger the financial or physical well-being of the trustees. The truth of it hit me like a physical blow. This wasn't just estate planning. This was a shield. Clara had seen the flaw in our daughter, the vein of selfishness and greed that I and my fatherly love had always excused or ignored. She had built a firewall to protect our life's work, to protect me, and she had left the final powerful key in my hands. I was no longer an old man who had been kicked out of his home. I was the trustee holding the very foundations of my daughter's world in my hands. George Franklin's law office was a sanctuary of order. It was on the third floor of an old brick building downtown, a place that smelled of aged leather, brewing coffee, and the comforting dust of 1,000 legal precedents. The walls were lined with shelves of thick leather-bound books that held the collective wisdom of the law. It was the complete opposite of the sterile hotel room and the chaotic battlefield my home had become. It was a place where facts mattered. As I sat in a deep leather armchair across from his massive mahogany desk, I felt a sense of grounding for the first time in 24 hours. The briefcase lay open between us, its contents spread out like a map to a hidden kingdom. George, with his reading glasses perched on the end of his nose, read through the trust document one last time, a low whistle escaping his lips. He finally looked up at me, his eyes magnified by the lenses. There was a look of profound admiration on his face. "David," he said, his voice a low, respectful rumble. "I've said it before, and I'll say it again. Your wife Clara was a bona fide genius." He tapped a perfectly manicured finger on the document. "I helped her draft this 5 years ago, but seeing it now in this context, it's a masterpiece of legal protection. It's like she saw this exact day coming." I watched him waiting. I knew what the papers said, but I needed to hear it from him to understand the full power of the weapon Clara had left for me. "Let me break this down for you in simple terms," George continued, leaning forward. "Forget everything you thought you knew about who owns your house. As of the date this trust was signed, you and Clara ceased to be the owners. You willingly and legally transferred the title of the property to a new separate entity, the Peterson Family Trust." He let that sink in for a moment. "Think of the trust as a fortress," he explained. "You and Clara were the guardians of that fortress, the trustees. You managed it, you paid its bills, you made the rules. Jessica," he said, pausing for effect, "was never given ownership. She was merely granted the privilege of living inside the fortress walls. She is a beneficiary, yes, but a conditional one. Her right to be there was never a blank check. It was a gift loaned to her based on the assumption of her good behavior." My mind was racing, connecting the dots, seeing the sheer brilliance of Clara's plan. She had insulated our life's work from the very person we had built it for. It was a heartbreaking act of love. George saw the understanding dawning on my face. He pushed on, his voice firm, driving the final, most important point home. "And now, David, with Clara gone, you are not just a guardian. You are the sole commander of the fortress. As the sole acting trustee, you have the complete, undisputed, and absolute legal authority to enforce the rules of this trust. And those rules, he said, picking up the document and pointing to a specific clause, are crystal clear. Jessica's right to live in that house is entirely contingent on her not causing harm, financial or otherwise, to the trustees. He took off his glasses and looked at me directly, the lawyer receding and my friend returning. She didn't just throw coffee on her father, David. From a legal standpoint, the beneficiary committed an act of aggression against the trustee. She didn't just demand your retirement money. The beneficiary attempted to extort the assets of the man in charge of the trust she benefits from. She hasn't just broken your heart. She has fundamentally violated the terms of her residency. He leaned back in his chair, the leather creaking. So to be clear, Jessica does not own the house. She has no claim to it. And you, my friend, you have every right to enforce the consequences. George leaned forward, his demeanor shifting from that of a comforting friend to a seasoned legal predator who had just spotted a fatal weakness in his opponent's defenses. He slid the heavy bond paper of the trust document across the polished mahogany until it was directly in front of me. His index finger, blunt and steady, came down on a single paragraph in the middle of page 7. It was under the section titled Beneficiary Covenants and Obligations. He tapped the paper twice for emphasis. This, David, he said, his voice low and precise, this is the engine of the entire machine Clara built. It's the clause that matters more than any other. Read it. I leaned in, my eyes focusing on the crisp black text. It was written in stark, unambiguous language, the kind of sentences that leave no room for interpretation. The beneficiary. Jessica Peterson, I read aloud, my own voice a stranger to my ears, shall not engage in any action that may cause financial, emotional, or physical harm to the acting trustee or trustees. Furthermore, the beneficiary shall not attempt to unduly influence, coerce, or seize assets belonging to the trustees for personal gain. The words hung in the air, a perfect, devastating indictment of everything that had happened yesterday morning. It was as if Clara had been a fly on the wall, taking notes for the future. George let out a short, sharp breath that wasn't quite a laugh. It was a sound of pure, unadulterated legal satisfaction. He leaned back in his chair, the leather groaning in protest. It's beautiful, isn't it? So simple, so direct. He steepled his fingers, looking at me over the top of them. Let's just play this out, shall we? Let's put Jessica's and Mark's actions from yesterday up against this specific clause. They came to your home under false pretenses. They presented you with a fraudulent debt. They demanded, not asked, but demanded that you liquidate your personal retirement assets to cover it. How does that square with, shall not attempt to seize assets for personal gain? He didn't wait for an answer. He was on a roll, the righteous anger building in his voice. And then there's the coffee. He shook his head slowly, a grim smile touching his lips. It wasn't a happy smile. It was the smile of a man who knew he had an unbeatable hand. Your daughter, the beneficiary of this trust, threw scalding liquid on you, the sole acting trustee. I think even a first-year law student could argue that qualifies as causing physical harm. It's not just a family squabble anymore, David. She didn't just cross a line of common decency. She took a sledgehammer and smashed a foundational covenant of the legal document that grants her the very privilege of living in that house. He stood up and walked to the window, looking down at the bustling street below. Do you see now? Clara wasn't just being cautious. She was being prophetic. She saw this wasn't just a possibility. It was a probability. She knew that Jessica's weakness, her sense of entitlement amplified by that parasite she married, could one day become a direct threat to you. So she didn't build a wall. She built a cage. A comfortable, beautiful cage, but a cage nonetheless, with one very clear rule written on the door. Do not bite the hand that feeds you. He turned back to me, his eyes blazing with conviction. "Well, David, yesterday she didn't just bite. She tried to sever the whole arm, and in doing so she just handed you the key to the lock." A heavy silence settled in George's office, filled only by the quiet ticking of a grandfather clock in the corner. I ran my thumb over Clara's signature on the trust document. It felt like I was touching her hand one last time. I now understood the legal power I held, but George was right. It was a shield, a defensive weapon. The attack, however, was still coming. Mark's Monday deadline loomed, and the debt was still a mystery. George seemed to read my mind. He walked back to his desk and sat down all business once again. "Okay, David," he said, his voice dropping to a low conspiratorial tone. "We have our defense. Clara's foresight gave us an ironclad fortress. But a fortress isn't enough. To win a war, you need intelligence. You need to know your enemy." He folded his hands on the desk, his expression serious. "This $600,000 story Mark spun, it's full of holes. A simple crypto investment gone bad. It's too neat. It's the kind of story a lazy liar tells. For a sum that large with a deadline that tight, there's something dirtier going on. Something he's desperate to hide." He leaned forward, his eyes locking onto mine. "I want to hire a private investigator. I have a man I've used for years. His name is Ben Carter. He's an ex-homicide detective, smart, thorough, and as discreet as a priest in a confessional. I want to put him on Mark. I want to know who he owes that money to. I want to know where every last cent of his supposed investment went. I want to know everything." George's voice was grim. "Before we make our next move, we need to know exactly what kind of monster we're dealing with." The man who had been thrown out of his own home 2 days ago might have hesitated, but that man was gone. In his place was the trustee of Clara's legacy. "Do it," I said, my voice firm without a trace of doubt. The days that followed were a strange kind of purgatory. I continued to live out of the anonymous hotel room, a ghost in my own life. I would wake up, drink the bitter complimentary coffee, and watch the hours crawl by on a television screen showing game shows and soap operas I didn't care about. The only connection to my old life, my only source of torment, was the phone in my pocket. It became a relentless portal for Jessica's rage. The first day, the texts were demanding. "Dad, where are you? This isn't funny. We need to talk." Then Mark says the deadline is real. "Stop being so childish and answer your phone." When I didn't reply, the tone shifted. The demands curdled into insults. "I can't believe how selfish you are. Are you really going to let us be ruined over some money you're not even using?" Then came the texts that were designed to wound me in the deepest way possible. "Mom would be so ashamed of you. She would have helped us in a heartbeat." I read that one and had to sit down on the edge of the hotel bed, the room seeming to tilt around me. It was a vicious, calculated blow. Mark tried a different tactic, sending a single menacing message. "David, you're making a huge mistake. These people don't play games." I stared at the words, a cold knot tightening in my stomach. Through it all, I followed George's instructions. I didn't answer. I didn't reply. Each notification, each buzz of the phone was a test of my newfound resolve. Every time I ignored a call, every time I deleted a hateful message without responding, I felt a small, hard piece of my old, softer self chip away, replaced by something stronger. I was grieving, I realized, not for my home, but for the daughter I thought I had raised. And with each unanswered call, I was slowly, painfully letting that version of her go. On the 4th day, the phone buzzed again with Jessica's name. I looked at it, at the screen that had become a source of such pain. Then, with a calm I hadn't felt in years, I pressed the power button and held it down until the screen went black. The silence that followed was the most peaceful sound I had ever heard. The call from George came on a Friday afternoon, a week after I had first walked into his office. His voice on the phone was devoid of its usual warmth. It was clipped, urgent. "David, it's George. Ben's report is in. You need to get down to my office. Right now." I didn't ask any questions. I just put on my shoes, walked out of the hotel, and drove. When I arrived, the atmosphere was heavy. George wasn't smiling. He simply nodded toward the chair I had sat in before and slid a thick brown manila folder across the polished surface of his desk. It landed with a soft, ominous thud. I asked Ben to find out about a bad investment. George said, his voice a low growl. What he found. "David, this is something else entirely. Your son-in-law is not a failed investor who made a stupid mistake. He is a professional thief who built a careful, deliberate trap." I opened the folder. The first page was a summary, and the words seemed to leap off the page, each one a separate blow. Mark's company, Prestige Property Ventures, was a sham, a shell corporation with a fancy website and a rented mailbox. The crypto story was a complete fabrication, a lie to cover a far more sinister truth. He was a real estate con artist. George explained the scheme in sickening detail. Mark had created a ghost project, a non-existent luxury condo development called Seaview Terraces. He had glossy brochures printed showing beautiful people laughing on sun-drenched balconies that would never be built. He had architectural renderings of a swimming pool that was nothing more than an artist's fantasy. Then he had gone hunting. His prey wasn't big corporations or wealthy investors. He targeted the vulnerable. The report was filled with names, each one a small tragedy. A retired couple from Ohio who had given Mark their entire retirement nest egg, $150,000, as a down payment on a condo where they planned to spend their golden years. A young doctor who had invested $75,000 her savings from years of residency. A widowed schoolteacher who had trusted Mark with the $50,000 her husband had left her. He had charmed them, sold them a dream of ocean breezes and a secure future, and then he had simply taken their money and disappeared. He wasn't just a bad businessman. He was a parasite feeding on the trust and hope of good people. A wave of nausea washed over me. This wasn't just about my money or my house. This man had destroyed lives. But that wasn't the worst of it. The $600,000, George said, his voice barely a whisper. That's not the money he owes to those poor people, David. That's the money he owes to his partners. He explained that the seed money to set up the scam, to print the brochures and build the fake website, had come from a private lender. A loan sharking operation with deep ties to organized crime. These aren't the kind of people who send strongly worded letters from a lawyer. David, George said, his eyes dark with the implication. They're the kind of people who break kneecaps as a first warning. The Monday deadline wasn't about a bank. It was about Mark's physical health. He was terrified. And then the final ugly piece of the puzzle clicked into place. He was never going to pay you back. George stated the fact laid bare and ugly on his desk. His plan was to take your life savings, pay off the mob, and vanish before the victims he scammed could find him and press charges. He wasn't trying to get a loan from his father-in-law. He was trying to make you the final bag holder, the last person to be cheated before he rode off into the sunset. I looked down at the file, at a grainy photo of the retired schoolteacher, a kind-looking woman with a gentle smile. Mark hadn't just insulted me. He hadn't just assaulted me. He had tried to make me an unwitting accomplice in the destruction of that woman's life. Any last shred of pity I had for Jessica for her poor judgment in marrying this man evaporated. She had tied herself to a monster, and that monster was now my responsibility to stop. With the PI's report lying between us like a venomous snake, the path forward became clear. The time for quiet waiting was over. The time for action had come. George, ever the strategist, swiveled in his high-backed leather chair and began to type. He didn't speak for several minutes, the only sound in the room, the confident, rhythmic click-clack of the keyboard. He was composing the instrument of their downfall, and he did so with the focused precision of a master craftsman. Finally, he spun the monitor toward me. On the screen was a formal letter drafted on his firm's official letterhead. It was a work of art, a masterpiece of strategic ambiguity. It was addressed to Ms. Jessica Peterson and Mr. Mark Thompson. It was polite, professional, and utterly lethal. It requested their presence at a mandatory meeting in his office the following Friday at 10 o'clock in the morning. The genius was in the stated purpose of the meeting. George had written that the meeting was to formally discuss the disbursement of assets from the Peterson family estate in order to reach a swift and amicable resolution to the current financial situation. Every word was technically true, but it was designed to be read by the greedy, the desperate, and the arrogant. It was a trap baited with the one thing he knew: they couldn't resist the smell of free money. He had it sent by a professional process server that afternoon, an official touch that made it feel both intimidating and non-negotiable. I could picture the scene in my own home. I imagined them stewing in my living room, the Monday deadline breathing down their necks, growing more desperate by the hour. Then the knock on the door. A man in a suit handing them a legal envelope. I could see the flash of fear in their eyes, quickly replaced by confusion, and then a dawning triumphant glee as they read the carefully chosen words. I could almost hear Mark's arrogant laugh echoing off my own walls. He caved. "I told you the old man would cave," he would say, clapping his hands together. "He just needed a little push." And Jessica, my daughter, would nod in agreement, her relief washing away any trace of guilt. "Of course he did," she would say, her voice full of that bottomless well of entitlement I now saw so clearly. "He's my father. He would never let anything bad happen to me." They would spend the next few days in a state of smug celebration, picking out new cars, planning expensive vacations. They would walk into George's office on Friday, not as people in trouble, but as conquering heroes arriving for the surrender ceremony. They believed they had won. They had no idea they were walking willingly into the jaws of a trap that had been set for them 5 years ago by a woman whose love was far wiser and more complex than they could ever comprehend. On Friday morning, I was in George's conference room a full hour before the scheduled meeting. We didn't speak much. We just sat, two old friends in a quiet room, waiting for the final act of a play that had been written long ago. The conference room itself was designed for intimidation. The table was a single massive piece of polished mahogany that seemed to absorb the light. The leather chairs were high-backed and imposing. From the windows on the 18th floor, the city below looked small and orderly. This was a room where fortunes were decided and futures were rewritten. It was the perfect stage. At precisely 10 o'clock, the door opened and they walked in. They were not dressed for a somber legal meeting. They were dressed for a victory party. Mark wore a tailored blue suit that screamed ambition, and Jessica was in a bright, stylish dress, carrying a designer handbag that probably cost more than my first car. They moved with an unearned confidence, a swagger that told me everything I needed to know. They truly believed they had won. They saw me sitting at the head of the table, and their smiles only widened. It was the condescending smile one gives to a child who has finally stopped throwing a tantrum. They didn't see a man in control. They saw a wallet that was about to be opened. George stood up, a model of professional courtesy. "Jessica, Mark. Thank you for coming. Please have a seat." He gestured to the 2 chairs on the far side of the table, deliberately creating a wide, polished battlefield between us. Mark didn't even look at me. He addressed George directly, as if I were a piece of furniture. "George," he said, his voice slick with false charm. "Glad we can finally put this unfortunate business behind us." He then turned his attention to me, his smile not reaching his eyes. "We trust you've had some time to think and have come to the right decision," he said, his tone leaving no doubt as to what that right decision was. Monday is coming up fast. Jessica was quieter, but no less arrogant. She avoided my gaze, busying herself by placing her expensive handbag perfectly parallel to the edge of the table. "We have lunch reservations at 1, she announced to the room, as if we were all on her schedule. "So hopefully this won't take too long." I remained silent through it all. I didn't greet them. I didn't acknowledge their condescending remarks. I simply sat there at the head of the table that felt like the head of my own life, and I watched them. My hands were folded calmly on the polished wood in front of me. My breathing was slow and even. The storm of grief and anger that had raged inside me for the past week had passed, leaving behind a profound and unnerving calm. I was no longer a father betrayed or a victim in shock. I was an auditor. I was here to examine the books, to find the discrepancies, and to correct the accounts. And I knew with absolute certainty that a final painful reckoning was about to be entered into the ledger. George settled back into his chair, the picture of calm authority. He placed his hands flat on the table, a gesture that was both open and commanding. He looked at Jessica and Mark, his expression unreadable, and began. "We have reviewed your request," he said, his voice filling the quiet room. "And we are, as stated in our letter, prepared to discuss a disbursement of assets." A flicker of triumph passed between Mark and Jessica. They leaned forward slightly, like wolves scenting a meal. They thought this was the moment of their victory. However, George continued, his tone hardening, just enough to cut through their arrogance. "Before we get to that, there is a preliminary matter we must address. We need to talk about this $600,000 debt." He reached down beside his chair and lifted the thick manila folder Ben Carter had prepared. He didn't open it. He simply placed it in the center of the vast, polished table. It sat there between us, an object of immense weight. Mark shifted in his seat, a hint of unease finally breaking through his smug facade. "What about it?" he asked, trying to sound dismissive. "It's a private business matter. We're here to discuss David's contribution." George's eyes narrowed. "On the contrary, Mark, when you are asking this family to contribute over $500,000, your business becomes our business. So let's talk about your investment." He gestured to the folder. "We've taken the liberty of doing some due diligence." And then George began to speak. He laid out the entire sordid story with the cold, dispassionate precision of a surgeon. He named the shell corporation Prestige Property Ventures. He named the ghost development Seaview Terraces. He spoke of the glossy brochures and the phantom swimming pool. And then he started listing the names of the victims. A retired couple from Ohio, he said, his voice steady. $150,000. Their entire life savings. A young doctor, he continued, his gaze fixed on Mark. $75,000. A widowed schoolteacher. With each name, a layer of Mark's composure was stripped away. The color drained from his face, leaving behind a pale, waxy sheen of sweat. His confident posture collapsed. He seemed to shrink in his expensive suit. This wasn't just an accusation. It was a dissection. George wasn't guessing. He was stating facts. The final killing blow came when George slid the folder across the table. It stopped directly in front of Mark. "This isn't a bad investment," George said, his voice dropping to a near whisper, yet carrying more menace than any shout. "This is felony fraud, grand larceny. This is a real estate scam. And you are the architect." The silence that followed was absolute. Mark stared at the folder as if it were a coiled snake, unable to speak, unable to move. The truth had finally cornered him. For the first time, Jessica looked away from the promise of money and looked at her husband. She saw not a financial wizard, but a cornered animal. The arrogance was gone, replaced by a raw, naked panic. Her brow furrowed in confusion. "Mark," she said. Her voice small, a child's voice in the suddenly cold and hostile room. "What is he talking about? What is in that folder?" He couldn't answer her. He couldn't even look at her. He just stared at the folder that held the complete and utter ruin of his life. George let the weight of Mark's deception hang in the air for a long moment. Then, with the calm demeanor of a chess master making his final game-ending move, he turned his attention to my daughter. "And that," he said. His voice smooth as ice, "brings us to the matter of the house." He reached into his briefcase and produced the thick blue-covered document Clara had left behind. He pushed it across the polished table. It slid silently, coming to a stop directly in front of Jessica. Her eyes wide with confusion and fear darted from the document to her husband, then to me. "This, Jessica, is the Peterson Family Trust." George explained, his tone leaving no room for argument. "It is the legal and sole owner of the property you currently reside in. Your mother, in her infinite foresight, transferred the home into this trust 5 years ago." He let that fact settle before continuing. "Your father is the sole acting trustee. You were named the beneficiary, which granted you the privilege of living there. But it was never a right. It was a gift with conditions." He leaned forward slightly. "And when you physically assaulted the trustee and attempted to extort his personal assets, you fundamentally and irrevocably violated those conditions. You broke the rules of the house." Then came the final, beautiful, terrible moment. George took a single crisp white sheet of paper from a file. He held it for a moment, then placed it gently on top of the thick trust document. The contrast was stark. "And this," he said, his voice quiet but final, "is a legal notice of eviction. Exercising his full authority as trustee, your father has terminated your status as a beneficiary of the trust. You and your husband have 30 days to remove yourselves and your belongings from the property." Their faces crumbled. The smug entitlement, the arrogant certainty, it all dissolved into pure, slack-jawed shock. They had walked in expecting a check for $600,000. They were walking out with an eviction notice. Throughout the entire meeting, I had not said a single word. Now I leaned forward and spoke for the first time. My voice was not loud. It was not angry. It was calm. And it was final. "Surprise, Jessica," I said, looking directly into my daughter's shattered eyes. "My gift to you is freedom. Freedom from the burden of the house. And freedom from you." The finality of my words sucked all the air out of the room. Jessica stared at me, her mouth slightly open, her mind refusing to process what she had just heard. The smug Victor from 10 minutes ago was gone, replaced by a ghost. Her carefully constructed world, built on a foundation of entitlement, and my assumed weakness, had just been leveled by a single quiet sentence. Mark was the first to break. He shot to his feet, the chair scraping violently against the floor. "You can't do this," he sputtered, his voice a pathetic mix of bluster and panic. "This is illegal. We'll sue. We'll take everything." George didn't even flinch. He remained seated, the picture of calm authority. "On what grounds, Mark?" he asked, his tone dangerously soft. "The trust is ironclad. And as for taking everything, I believe the folder in front of you," he gestured to the PI's report, "suggests you have far more pressing legal concerns than this one." That single sentence landed like a punch to the gut, and all the fight went out of Mark. He collapsed back into his chair, a broken man. Then Jessica finally crumbled. A dry, racking sob escaped her lips. "Dad, please." She whispered the word Dad, now a desperate plea instead of a title. "Please don't. Where will we go? What will we do?" I didn't answer. There was nothing left to say. George stood up. "This meeting is over," he announced to the silent room. He pressed a small button on the intercom on the desk. "Brenda, could you please show Mr. Thompson and Ms. Peterson out?" The door opened, and George's polite but firm assistant appeared. Jessica and Mark were escorted from the room like disgraced employees, not conquering heroes. The door clicked shut behind them, leaving a profound silence in its wake. I didn't feel the triumphant rush of victory I might have expected. There was no joy, no elation. There was only a deep, quiet sadness and the heavy peace of a necessary thing finally done. This wasn't revenge. Revenge is a hot, messy, and ultimately empty emotion. This was something different. It was the final, painful balancing of a moral ledger that had been in the red for far too long. I hadn't acted out of anger. I had simply executed the last will and testament of my wife's love, a love that was wise enough to protect our family even from itself. The 30 days passed in a blur of quiet activity. I hired a cleaning crew to scrub my house from top to bottom, an act that felt less like cleaning and more like an exorcism. I reclaimed my space room by room. I moved back in and began the slow, peaceful process of putting my life back in order. I slept in my own bed, drank tea in my own kitchen, and tended to Clara's roses, which were just beginning to bloom. The news about Mark came not as a dramatic explosion, but as a quiet, inevitable conclusion. George called me one evening as I was watching the sunset from my back porch. "Turn on the local news," David, was all he said. I did, and there was Mark's face, a grainy mugshot shot on the screen. He had been arrested earlier that day. The victims from the PI's report, the retired teacher, and the young couple, and all the others had found each other. They had banded together, hired a lawyer, and brought the full weight of the law down on him. He was facing multiple counts of felony fraud. There was no pleasure in seeing him disgraced, only a grim sense of relief. A predator had been taken off the streets. A chapter had been closed. I turned off the television and went back to watching the sunset, feeling a quiet sense of order settling over the world. 2 days later, my phone rang. I saw Jessica's name on the screen, and my first instinct was to ignore it, a conditioned response from weeks of her hateful messages. But something made me answer. I steeled myself for another barrage of accusations or demands. Instead, all I heard was a broken, ragged sound, the sound of someone weeping without restraint. "Dad," a small, choked voice whispered. "Dad, it's me." I didn't speak. I just listened. I have nothing," she sobbed, her words punctuated by desperate gasps for air. "They took the car. The bank froze everything because of Mark. I'm staying on a friend's couch. I'm so sorry, Dad. I am so sorry. For everything. You were right. I was wrong. I was so stupid and so wrong." This was not the calculated performance of a manipulator. This was the raw, unfiltered sound of a life that had completely imploded. It was the first time in years that I had heard the voice of my real daughter, the vulnerable child hidden beneath the layers of greed and entitlement. For the first time, her apology sounded like the truth. I listened to my daughter cry, and for the first time I didn't feel the immediate instinctual urge to rush in and fix everything. The old me would have. The old me would have said, "It's okay, just come home." But the old me was gone. After her sobs subsided into a fragile silence, I finally spoke. My voice was not cold, but it was not warm either. It was the voice of a man who had learned the hard lesson of setting boundaries. "I hear you, Jessica," I said quietly, "and I accept your apology. But apologies don't erase what happened." I took a breath, letting the weight of my next words settle. "You cannot come back to the house. That is no longer an option." I let the finality of that statement hang in the air before I continued. "But I will not see you on the street. Here is what I will do. I will pay the security deposit and the first 6 months of rent on a small 1-bedroom apartment. I will also pay for you to see a therapist. I think you have a lot to work through, and you need professional help to do it." I paused, making sure she understood the terms. This was not a negotiation. It was the new reality. After those 6 months, you are on your own. You need to get a job. You need to support yourself. You need to finally learn to stand on your own 2 feet. I thought of Clara and of the promise I had made to her. This was the only way to truly protect our daughter. "I will always love you, Jessica," I said, and it was the truth. But love is not a blank check. A few months later, the house was quiet again. But it was a different kind of quiet. It wasn't the lonely silence of grief, but the peaceful silence of a life put back in order. I was in the living room sorting through a box of old photographs, a task I hadn't had the heart to face since Clara passed. I picked one up. It was of the 2 of us standing on the front lawn the day we bought this house, young and foolish, and full of a hope so bright it was almost blinding. I looked from the smiling face of the young woman in the photograph to the garden, just outside the window, her garden where the roses were in full bloom. And I felt her presence not as a painful absence, but as a warm and steady light. It was her wisdom that had been my shield, her love my guide. This house, this life we built was safe. I had protected our legacy. But more than that, I had given our daughter the one gift I never knew she needed, the difficult, painful, necessary chance to grow up. The accounts were balanced. The order was restored. And in the quiet of my own home, I finally felt at peace. This story teaches us that true love must be paired with self-respect. For years, David's unconditional support was mistaken for weakness, enabling a sense of entitlement that became a weapon against him. By finally setting firm boundaries, he didn't stop loving his daughter. He started respecting himself. The hardest lesson he taught was that genuine love isn't a blank check for destructive behavior, but the difficult gift of accountability. Sometimes the most profound act of love is allowing someone to face the consequences of their choices, giving them the only real chance they have to grow. What would you have done in David's situation? And have you ever had to set a difficult boundary to protect yourself? Share your thoughts and experiences in the comments below.